because they've been seduced by the numbers and will, scrape up every dollar from wherever they can get it.
People think they understand Pink Floyd. They remember the sound, the lights, the feeling of being pulled into something bigger than music itself. They remember the albums that defined a generation, the songs that seemed to understand loneliness, fear, and everything in between. But what most people never saw was what was happening behind all of that. Because Pink Floyd did not slowly drift apart like other bands. It cracked from the inside. Quietly at first, then all at once. At the center of it stood Roger Waters, a man who did not just want to write music but to control the meaning of it, the direction of it, and eventually the people around him. The success made that easier. Every album gave him more authority, more confidence, and more distance from the others. And the others felt it. Not all at once, not in one argument, but in a series of moments that became harder to ignore. What looked like creative genius from the outside often felt like pressure from the inside. Ideas were no longer shared, they were decided. Contributions were no longer equal, they were judged. And slowly, the balance that had once made Pink Floyd powerful began to disappear. What replaced it was something far more dangerous. Control. Silence. Resentment that had nowhere to go. This was not just a band struggling to agree. This was a group of men who no longer trusted each other, forced to keep creating while everything between them was breaking. And the most uncomfortable truth is this. The people who helped build Pink Floyd into something unforgettable were the same people who would eventually tear it apart. These were not outsiders. They were not rivals. They were the men standing right next to Roger Waters. And by the time it was over, the music survived, but the relationships did not. Roger Waters was born on the 6th of September 1943 in England into a world already shaped by loss. His father died in the war before he ever had the chance to truly know him, and that absence did not fade with time. It settled deep, shaping the way he saw authority, control, and the fragility of everything around him. Long before fame, there was already a sense that nothing lasted, and that if you wanted something to survive, you had to hold on to it tightly. When Pink Floyd began, Waters was not the obvious center. That place belonged to Syd Barrett, whose creativity defined the band's earliest sound. But when Barrett began to slip away, lost in a haze that no one could fully control, something shifted. Waters did not just step forward. He took responsibility. And with that responsibility came something else. A growing belief that he was the one who understood what the band should be. As the years passed, that belief turned into direction, and that direction slowly became control. Albums like The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall were not just successes, they were statements. Carefully constructed, deeply personal, and increasingly dominated by Waters' vision. To the audience, it looked like brilliance. To the band, it began to feel like something else entirely. Because Waters was not just writing songs, he was shaping narratives, deciding themes, and pushing everyone toward a single voice, his own. Collaborations started to shrink. Disagreements were no longer creative debates, they became obstacles. And the more successful the band became, the harder it was for anyone to push back against the man who seemed to be driving it all forward. What made it more complicated was this. Waters was not wrong about his talent. He was not wrong about his ambition. But somewhere between vision and control, the balance broke. And once it did, every relationship inside Pink Floyd began to change. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in ways that could not be undone. Behind the sound that defined an at. Number 5. Syd Barrett. Before Roger Waters became the voice of Pink Floyd, there was another presence that defined everything the band was meant to be, and that was Syd Barrett. He was not just the frontman, he was the identity, the strange brilliance that made the band different from anything else at the time. Waters stood beside him in those early days, watching, learning, and perhaps even measuring himself against a man who seemed completely untouchable in his creativity. But what made Barrett extraordinary also made him fragile, and as his mind began to slip under the weight of LSD and pressure, the band found itself facing a decision no one wanted to make. At first it was confusion. Barrett would forget chords drift during performances, or simply stand there disconnected from everything around him. The man who once led the band was slowly disappearing in front of them, and Waters saw it up close. This was not just about music, it was about watching a friend fall apart while knowing the band could not survive like this. The tension built quietly, because no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud, but eventually, it became unavoidable. Barrett had to go. That moment changed everything, not just for Pink Floyd, but for Waters himself. Because stepping into that space did not feel like a victory. It felt like replacing someone who should never have been replaced. And yet, that is exactly what happened. Waters began to take control first out of necessity, then out of conviction. The band needed direction, and he believed he was the only one who could give it. But something stayed with him after Barrett was gone. A kind of shadow. The memory of what happens when control is lost, when a mind drifts too far when no one can bring it back. That fear did not make Waters softer. It made him more determined, more controlling, less willing to leave anything to chance. And in a quiet, almost unspoken way, Syd Barrett became the first fracture inside Pink Floyd. Not because of conflict, but because of what his absence created. A space that Waters filled completely, and once he did, there was no going back to what the band used to be. Number 4. Nick Mason. If Syd Barrett was the beginning of the fracture, then Nick Mason was the man who lived inside it without ever truly escaping. He was there from the start, steady, observant, never the loudest voice in the room, but always present. While others clashed or disappeared, Mason remained, watching the balance of the band slowly shift towards something far more uncomfortable than creative tension. Because what was happening was not explosive, it was controlled, and that made it harder to confront. At first, Mason seemed untouched by it. He played his role, contributed where he could, and avoided the kind of confrontations that were beginning to define the band's internal dynamic. But that distance came at a cost. As Roger Waters grew more certain of his direction, Mason found himself speaking less, not because he had nothing to say, but because it was becoming clear that saying it would not change anything. The conversations were no longer open. Decisions were no longer shared. They were delivered. What made it worse was that Mason understood exactly what was happening and still chose to stay. He saw the way David Gilmour began to push back. He saw the growing frustration from Richard Wright, and he felt the silence settling over the group whenever Waters made it clear that his vision came first. Mason was not blind to the tension he was living inside it day after day, album after album. The turning point was not one dramatic argument, but the slow realization that his role had changed without anyone saying it out loud. He was no longer part of a band making decisions together. He was part of a structure built around one man's ideas. And the more successful those ideas became, the harder it was to argue against them. Success became the shield that protected control. By the time the wall was taking shape, Mason's presence felt almost symbolic. He was still there, still playing, still part of the name Pink Floyd, but the influence he once had was fading. Not because he lost his ability, but because the space to use it had disappeared. And that is what made this fracture so dangerous. It did not remove people, it reduced them. Nick Mason did not fight Roger Waters the way others would. He did something quieter and in many ways more telling. He stepped back, and in doing so he became proof that Pink Floyd was no longer a band of equals but something else entirely. Number 3. Richard Wright. If there was one man who truly understood the soul of Pink Floyd beyond words, it was Richard Wright. His sound was not aggressive, not dominant, but essential. The space, the atmosphere, the feeling that made Pink Floyd different from every other band, much of that came from Wright. And for years that balance worked. Waters brought the concepts, Gilmour brought the emotion, and Wright created the world those ideas lived in. But that balance did not survive the rise of control. At first, the change was subtle. Wright's contributions were still there, but they were no longer central. Roger Waters began to take more ownership over the direction, shaping not just the themes but the structure of the music itself. Wright, who worked best in collaboration, found himself in a space where collaboration was quietly disappearing. Ideas were no longer built together, they were approved or dismissed. The tension grew during the recording of The Wall, an album that would become one of the most iconic in music history but also one of the most toxic environments the band had ever experienced. Waters was no longer asking, he was demanding. Deadlines, expectations, pressure, all of it tightened around the band, and Wright was the one who struggled the most within that system. Not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to become just another piece in someone else's vision. Then came the moment that changed everything. Waters made it clear that Wright was not contributing enough, that his presence was no longer justified in the way it once had been. And instead of fighting it publicly, the situation unfolded behind closed doors where decisions carried more weight and fewer witnesses. Wright was pushed out of the band during the making of The Wall, quietly but definitively. What makes this moment almost unbelievable is what happened next. Wright still performed on the tour for The Wall, but not as a member of Pink Floyd. He was paid as a session musician, playing the same music he helped shape standing on stage with the band that had just removed him. It was not just a professional shift, it was a statement. Pink Floyd was no longer about who built it. It was about who controlled it. That was the breaking point. Not the first crack, but the moment no one could deny what was happening anymore. A founding member reduced to an outsider, not because of failure, but because he no longer fit into a system that demanded obedience over collaboration. And once that line was crossed, there was no illusion left. Pink Floyd was no longer a band holding itself together. It was a structure beginning to collapse from within. Number 2, David Gilmour. If there was one man who could stand opposite Roger Waters and not disappear, it was David Gilmour. He was not just a replacement for Syd Barrett, he became the emotional voice of Pink Floyd, the sound that gave feeling to the ideas. Where Waters was sharp, controlled, and driven by concept, Gilmour was instinctive, melodic, and grounded in what people actually felt when they listened. For a time, that contrast was exactly what made the band powerful. But eventually, it became the very thing that tore them apart. At the beginning, there was respect. Gilmour understood Waters' vision, and Waters recognized Gilmour's ability to bring that vision to life. Albums like The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here worked because neither side had fully taken over. There was still space, still balance, still a sense that Pink Floyd belonged to all of them. But success has a way of changing that balance, and by the time Animals arrived, the shift was impossible to ignore. Waters was no longer just leading, he was deciding. The themes became darker, more political, more personal, and less open to interpretation. Gilmour pushed back, not loudly at first, but enough to make it clear that he did not agree with everything. He wanted music that breathed, that allowed space for sound and emotion. Waters wanted structure, message control, and those two directions could not exist in the same room forever. The tension reached its peak during The Wall. What should have been another masterpiece became a battleground. Sessions were no longer about creating together, they were about surviving the process. Arguments became sharper, patience disappeared, and the distance between the two men grew into something neither could ignore. One of the clearest moments came during the creation of Comfortably Numb, a song now considered one of the greatest ever recorded. Even that was not spared. They argued over arrangement, over tone, over what it should feel like. Two visions fighting inside the same piece of music. By the time the final cut arrived, the conflict was no longer hidden. The album felt less like Pink Floyd and more like a Roger Waters project, and Gilmour knew it. The partnership was broken not because one of them lacked talent, but because neither of them was willing to step back anymore. Waters believed he was protecting the integrity of the band. Gilmour believed he was protecting what made it human. And that is what made this fracture the most dangerous of all. This was not silence like Mason, or removal like Wright. This was confrontation. Two forces that once completed each other now pushing in opposite directions, with nothing left to hold them together. Once that line was crossed, there was no returning to what Pink Floyd had been. Number 1. The legal war. By the time Roger Waters walked away, it was no longer a question of whether Pink Floyd could survive as a band. In his mind, it could not. He believed the story had reached its natural end, that without him there was no meaning left in the name. But what he did not expect was this. The others were not ready to let it go. When David Gilmour and Nick Mason chose to continue under the name Pink Floyd, it crossed a line Waters never imagined would be crossed. This was not just disagreement anymore. This was ownership, identity, legacy, and suddenly everything they had built together became something to fight over. Waters saw it as a betrayal. To him, Pink Floyd was not just a brand, it was a concept, something tied directly to the work he had shaped for years. Letting it continue without him felt like watching someone take control of a story he believed was his. But Gilmour saw it differently. To him, Pink Floyd had always been more than one person, and walking away did not mean the band had to end. The conflict moved out of studios and into courtrooms. Quiet conversations were replaced by legal arguments. The same people who once stood on stage together were now communicating through lawyers. Every decision, every right, every use of the name became a point of tension. And what made it worse was that there was no real way to win. Because no matter what the outcome was, something had already been lost. In the end, Gilmour and Mason kept the name. Pink Floyd continued releasing new music, performing to massive audiences, proving that the band could exist without Waters. But that victory came with a cost. Because what remained was not the same band that had once created those defining albums together. It was something changed, something divided at its core. For Waters, this was the final fracture. Not a quiet one, not something hidden behind the music, but a complete break. The man who had once driven Pink Floyd forward was now outside of it, watching it continue without him. And no matter how much success followed, that reality never truly disappeared. This was no longer about songs or albums or creative differences. This was about control, identity, and the question of who truly owns a legacy once it has been shared. And by the time the legal battle settled, one thing had become clear. Pink Floyd had not simply ended. It had split into two truths, both existing but never able to come back together. In the end, Pink Floyd did not disappear. The music is still there, the albums still sound as powerful as they did decades ago, and the name still carries a weight that few bands will ever reach. But if you look closely, what remains is not a complete story. It is a story divided, shaped by people who could no longer stand on the same side of it. Roger Waters never stopped being a defining force. His ideas, his words, his vision are woven into the very foundation of what Pink Floyd became. But that same intensity, the need to control, to shape everything into something precise and personal, is also what built the distance he could never close again. The wall he wrote about was not just a metaphor. It became real, standing between him and the very people who once helped him create something unforgettable. And yet there is something almost unsettling about how it all settled. Years later, they stood on the same stage again, not as a restored band, but as men who shared a past they could never fully return to. The moment felt important, even emotional, but it was not a reunion in the way people imagined. It was something quieter, a recognition of what had been and what could never be again. Because some fractures do not heal. They simply become part of the story. Pink Floyd was never just about sound. It was about tension, about ideas pushed to their limits, about people trying to create something larger than themselves. And in doing so, they created something that could not hold together forever. Not because they failed, but because they went too far, too deep, too personal. And that may be the most honest part of it all. The music survived. The legend survived. But the bond between the men who built it did not. In the end, Roger Waters did not just help create Pink Floyd. He helped define exactly how it would fall apart.